Great. Well, we have a lot of content that we are going to cover in this short go of the webinar, so I'm going to jump right into the content. But usually when I get started, I like to empathize a little bit. So any of you who are public speakers out there or who go to conferences or even give staff briefings, it's actually something that's very similar to stand-up comics in terms of you actually have a very similar experience of you might be throwing everything you've got at them and there's just nothing coming back. There's just low engagement with the audience. And so this presentation is really tooled at helping to help you to overcome any of those obstacles and really engage with the audience. And so this is actually the first part of a three-part series I typically teach. This is really focused on the slide design aspect of telling a visual story through the design. The next part is really more emphasized on the storytelling itself. And then the third segment is really on public speaking. So if you really enjoy this, I'd be happy to come back and do another segment. So you can feel free to comment if you are interested in these other segments. So typically I might start off with what is a presentation, but in this case, it's actually easier to start off with what is not a presentation. And the most common one that I used to see a lot more of this is what I call the document. It's greater than 75 words, lots of text crammed onto a slide. The interesting thing that happens here is in this case, the audience tends to start reading through that content, even if it was just meant to be a reference. People actually start to read that text on the slide, and they tend to disconnect from you as the speaker, and it becomes harder for them to reconnect with you. And if this keeps happening regularly throughout the presentation, it'll be harder for them to reconnect with you as the presenter. The next one I like to call the teleprompter. This is really what I call the group reading session in terms of the audience is going to read ahead of the presenter. They're going to read all the bullets that are laid out, and they're going to wait for you to catch up to them. But this is opposite of what you would expect in a YouTube experience where they can read it and skim ahead with the video scrubber there and then wait for you to go back to a topic that they're ready to re-engage with. Otherwise, they typically have to wait and wait for you to catch up to where they're at. Now, I will say that this is greater than 50 words here, but I usually recommend no more than 27 words specifically because there's a lot of research in terms of how much information people can retain in a single communication. And 27 words is kind of the breaking point. And this is used in crisis communications and other methods as well. Now, there was actually a study done at Harvard about the effectiveness of presentation platforms. They looked at oral presentations, meaning no slide deck. They also talked about PowerPoint, but PowerPoint as it's used today, how most people use PowerPoint, and then ZUIs or zoomable user interfaces like Prezi. Now the interesting thing here was that there was really no difference between the oral presentation and PowerPoint. They actually found that people were more engaged with an oral presentation than with most people's PowerPoints because they were waiting and engaged and waiting to hear what the speaker had to say rather than reading ahead of the presenter and then waiting for them to catch up. So there was way different engagement in terms of the oral presentation versus PowerPoint. So the key here is that if you have a visual story to tell, then use the presentation. If you don't have a visual story to tell, then oral may be better for you than giving any slides at all. And the key here is really that you need to separate the document from the presentation. Oftentimes you see people are handing out their presentation deck as is, as a document for everyone to follow along. But there's some challenges with that, and we'll talk about that in a second. So it's really important to separate the document, prepare something separate that you can hand out to the audience after your presentation is over to have all the information that they would need. The true slide is really only supposed to represent a single idea at a time. You're going to talk about one idea, go through that, and then move to the next. And it's okay to have many of them. And so one of the things I do when I'm coaching people in their presentations is I'll give them Post-it notes, the standard size Post-it notes, and say you can have as many of these as you want. And I might give them a Sharpie, and if they have really fine penmanship, I'll actually give them a wedge Sharpie to keep them from cramming a lot onto that Post-it, but really force them into it's okay to have many of these Post-its. And we typically work through that. Now the key to this, and this is typically what I would ask an audience, is how long do you think it should take from an audience member to look at the slide deck and take in what is on the slide and kind of understand, okay, this is what that means, and then reorient their focus back on the presenter. Now, get lots of answers from the audience at that point, but it really is only 3 seconds or less. If it takes any longer than that, then you're going to start to lose that audience and they're going to start to disengage with you. So it's really important from an attention standpoint that you keep that window of time short, so you're only releasing a little bit of information at a time up on the slide, so that way they can see what it is, re-engage with the speaker. And the core purpose of this is that a true presentation focuses on the presenter and uses the slides as a visual aid to help them to reinforce that story. The other thing that's really funny that's happened over time is that bullets has become this symbol of boredom to audiences. It's really weird how many of these post-presentation surveys have gone out with taking the same presentation and then just removing the bullet points from them, and the audience thinks it's a better presentation, which is really weird. But it's just this association that people have had over the years of bullets equaling some sort of low energy presentation. So it's just something to consider. And as part of that, we can thank PowerPoint for really the rise of the bullet point, because when they gave you your first templates, what do you see when you make a new slide? An option to put lots of bullets in there. So this has really fundamentally changed from what it used to be, where there was the carousel and you would select certain photos that you're telling a story as you're clicking through it. That was originally what the presentations were designed to be like, and you had to pay for a designer to make slides for you if you wanted to make custom slides. And so designers were really interfacing all the presentations at that point. So presentations were much better back in the day before PowerPoint. Now, when I'm coaching somebody, I'll say, okay, you have your outline, you're thinking of what you want to say. Please don't start in a presentation software. Open up Word doc or a Google Doc and start to just bullet point out all of the things that you need to talk about in your presentation. And then what I'll have them do is print out that document and then take a highlighter and actually highlight the key words and phrases that are really the most important pieces of that written text that you write up as your summary. And then those highlighted points become your Post-it notes. Those are essentially your slides, those big emphasis points that you need to talk through. And now you can actually make your narrative by storyboarding these ideas. So you can actually take a storyboard, take the Post-it notes, and just keep moving them around the board as you want to craft your story. Now that you have kind of those key points, the next step is really finding the right image to give you the right visual cues to better understand what that person is talking about in that moment. Now, for example, if you have a building that you're going to be talking about, there's a new building coming out that we are about to open, you might have an interior and an exterior shot. Instead of putting them all together as like a collage, you would do one at a time. You might even show the old building, show where we were and then where we're going. You have the new building, you talk about the exterior, and then you go into, okay, we've got to talk about the interior now. So we'll do an interior shot, and then at some point you could go to a previous and future image side by side to get contrast, but you build to that combination of multiple images. You don't start with it. You start with individuals, talk about those things, and then build to a moment where you need to make contrast. And the other key here to make is that you want to design, not decorate. So oftentimes I see a lot of presentations where they have a cool image and they put a lot of text over it, but the image really doesn't have much to do with the content of what they're talking about. That's really a perfect example of decorating rather than designing. What is the visual cue that's going to help them to understand what you're talking about better, and then keeping the text as concise as possible to be enough of a talking point to cue you to talk about that subject. This is a slide that was actually done by a TED designer. And the interesting thing about this image is it's a great example of when you need to create context. The image by itself is great. It's this, shipping containers crumpling on each other. But without the text, you really don't understand the context of what they're going to talk about. So preparing to fail gives you some context to what is going to be the topic of discussion. Now this next one's an even better one because it evokes emotion as well as context. It's just the beginning. So you can imagine either as the kid, your first day of school, or as the parent, what that feels like the first day of school. So you now have an emotion in addition to the meaning of that, the context of this image. In most of my presentations, I know the moment where I've swayed an audience. And one of these presentations was the Council of Deans and Vice Chancellors presentation when we were talking about the new home site redesign. And this was that slide in that presentation where the audience kind of switched over into my side of the argument. This was actually a pie chart showing the behavior by age of the different age groups, and this doesn't tell you a whole lot, but what I was able to do is simplify this. So I looked at different age groups and their behaviors. So we looked at 0 to 24 age groups. That made up 44% of our audience. And what were they doing? They were looking at admissions content, the calendar, and the about section. If we extend this to the 34 age group, that now makes up 65% of all the traffic. And what they were looking at was admissions, jobs, calendar, and about. So the only difference is the addition of jobs. Now if we look at 35 through the age of 65 plus, that makes up 35% of the audience, and they were looking at jobs, about, and calendar. So I've taken this thing that seems like it's very complex. It's the center home website for the whole university, and this is all people are looking at, only these things. So it makes it really simple to understand what people are actually engaging with. And then I went deeper into explaining each different audience and how they use the website and how we deal with that in the new design. So again, this was just simplifying some data and presenting that to them in this way. Now, when you're finding imagery, a lot of people like using Google. So although I don't always recommend going to Google as your first source of images, this is some tips to help better utilize Google without getting in trouble with licensing. So if you put elephant in as a search term, you'll notice that you can choose like images, for example. And then over on the side, you'll see settings and tools. If you click on tools, you'll actually see that there's these other options that come about. You have size, so you can choose large images to make sure you get good quality images. And then there's also this usage rights section where you can choose labeled for reuse or even labeled for non-commercial reuse, which will give you more options. The one I personally like for free stock photos is Unsplash. If you go to unsplash.com, you'll get lots of great quality images there. So you can look for your elephant photo. Great. All right, I've got some good options here. Now I've got my great elephant image. I'm ready to go for the next slide. In terms of tools, there's a handful of different tools that you can utilize. The most common two are Keynote and PowerPoint. I personally use Keynote. It was actually created for Steve Jobs internally, and then for his keynotes, and then they said, you know what, we need to release this to the public, and then it became a public application. It's really great for high quality visuals. The animations are amazing. The graphics in there are much better than what you would find in any of the other tools. There are these vector graphics that you can utilize, change the color for. It's basically like what clip art should have been, and it allows you to build presentations really quick in a pinch. Which I've done. I've been on an Amtrak and had 45 minutes to build a presentation and was able to build a really nice one using the tools that I have there. PowerPoint is great. You can still make good quality stuff in there. It takes a little bit longer time to make the same quality presentations, and I could go deeper if anybody's interested on that. But typically the way I do it is I'll build it in Keynote, export it to PowerPoint, and go from there. Keynote also, there is a cloud version, so if you have an iCloud account, even if you're on a PC, you can utilize that as well. But with all cloud-based things, like Google Slides is another good example of this. It's great for collaboration so that people can work on it together and you can see changes as they happen. However, when you're going to give your presentation, it's highly important to make an export of that presentation in PowerPoint or some other presentation software that can be locally hosted on your computer. So that way, if you lose your internet connection and you're about to give a big talk, that you have nothing to worry about. You've got it all saved on your computer. The other one that's had some ups and downs is Prezi. Prezi can be effective. I just urge you to master one of the other tools first before you think about using Prezi. And I really encourage some conservatism with Prezi because I've actually seen people get up out of a crowd and walk out of the room because they were getting motion sickness because it was just too much motion. So just be careful about Prezi. It can be very effective. Just be cautious about how much of those movement animations you use. So I'd like to give a little demo to give some examples of befores and after. This is an example of a slide that I was asked to clean up. And so what I typically do in this case is I'll say, okay, what of this do you actually need to talk about? Are you going to talk about all these things individually, or are you going to skip over one of them? We said, okay, great. These are the couple points that are going to be really expanded on. Let's break those out and make them a little bit better in terms of a visual presentation. So this gives them a little bit more of a visual presentation. It's still not perfectly where I would want to go for a majority of the presentation. Only some of the slides would have this much text on it, and then other slides would be more simplistic. This is another example of a slide deck that was going to be presented. This is about grandcanyon.ucdavis.edu. If you haven't checked out that website, I highly encourage you to do so. It's a website that my team created, and it's really amazing that the amount of context that people need when they are presented something like this. If you see these bullet points, an ambient video, interactive navigation, some of these things, it's not fully clear what these things mean. So you have to give context. So what did we do? We said, okay, how much time do you have? Great, let's start building a deck that within that time constraint. So this is the homepage of that website. We can actually see the interactive approach of the navigation here. These are all the different stops along the river where you can stop and you can say, okay, I'm going to take a look at that point in the river, and I'm going to get that experience of what that was like at that point. So this is what's called an ambient video at the top here. It allows them to see what it's like at that specific point in the river. And then you'll also notice that down here, you'll notice that interactive navigation comes along with them so that they can go to any one of those points on the river. Also, we utilize 360 video throughout this presentation, throughout the presentation in the website. And they can stop at any one moment and they can consume some 360 in that part of the Grand Canyon, and then we'll have some people talking about the science of that specific area. And then we would close out this presentation with the video that wraps it all together.
So here we are in the Grand Canyon. That's me, and I'm a graduate student at UC Davis. And being a grad student, it's easy to be consumed by books and lectures. But back here in the Grand Canyon with my classmates from UC Davis, it is impossible to find someone who isn't experiencing science at a personal level. And as a scientist, really, it's spiritual. Geologists are setting their eyes on the great unconformity. The hydrologists are rafting over sub and supercritical flows and hydraulic jumps, and ecologists are reaching out to touch the rich plant biodiversity. This isn't a textbook, and it's not images online. It's all right in front of you. The eco-geomorphology class at UC Davis is doing it right. Because here in the Grand Canyon, we're not just studying science, we're experiencing it. Join us on our journey through the Grand Canyon.
So you can let us know what you think was better, this one or the other. And I just encourage you, when you're thinking about potentially talking about websites, you don't have to do a full screen grab of a website. You can take a visual component that can be a cue for you to talk about that website in greater detail, and this is an example of that. I just have a couple more quick examples before we go into a Q&A here. This is an example of an ambient video in the background, so it's a video with no sound. I would highly recommend that you don't use a lot of motion if you are going to use a video in the background. Because that can be jarring for the audience, and it also can be distracting. So be careful about how much you use it. And then also the GIFs in the background. You can use more slower moving ones, or if it is a fast moving one, only have it go a couple of times before you interrupt it with a click and put like a still image up. Otherwise, it can be very distracting and take away from you and what you're talking about. So these are just some of the basics of helping to tell a visual story. We can talk a lot more about narrative strategy and how to build the structure of your story in a follow-up session if you'd like. But the key takeaways here that I'd like to remind you is if you can make sure that you're designing, not decorating, that an outline actually leads you to a document, not a presentation, and that a storyboard truly leads you to a presentation. Once you get comfortable with that experience, it'll be much easier for you to dive right into a presentation and build it in a visual story form. So I'm excited that you all will make the world better one presentation at a time. And let's talk and have some questions now. Yeah, sure.
Okay, so there are several questions here that I'm going to read aloud for Adam. How do you balance this advice with ADA compliance, Adam?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think the key with ADA is that it's a little different with a website versus a presentation. If you're doing a presentation, you really should be saying everything that the audience really needs to hear verbally. So for somebody who has auditory issues, though, that can be a challenge, and not everybody typically has a budget to have somebody be doing sign language. But thinking about your audience as much as possible and making sure that you're not leaving something for the slide only to be the place where you're telling that. So you can be visual on the slide, and then also having that discussion. If you know ahead of time who your audience is, and if you can provide any documents to them so that they can kind of read along either with Braille, or you have something that can be a document visually if they have a hearing issue, for them to be able to read along with you. And that's really where the document separation should happen. So that when you have that document, they can read along as you're going, and they can stay along with you. So I would start there.
Okay, and then the next question is, does UC provide resources to help develop these resources? As a resource specialist, I do not have expertise to develop the photos and video used to provide a more streamlined message.
Yeah, well, I think, if you have a really high valued presentation, a really high impact thing, then definitely, asking for some sort of budget to do some video production to align with a presentation or pitch would be helpful. There typically isn't central resources for these kind of things. These tips are really made so that you could go out and try to find as best quality images that you can to make a visual story yourself. It really isn't a whole lot of cost other than the coaching of guiding you through making a good visual story. So you can do a lot of this with a good talk and with good visuals. Just pulling imagery from unsplash.com is a great way to do that. If you do have some budget, you can use some stock photography, or I highly encourage, if you have your own photography, you can utilize. That's even better because audience tends to like that more. So there's levels of this, but I can do this really on a pinch and a budget with no real budget for even photos to be taken, and I'll use graphics and things like that that are built into Keynote. So you can do a lot of it in the tools that are provided in Keynote or PowerPoint.
Yes. Okay, and from the Cooperative Extension Office, Stanislaus, they're asking, did you use Keynote to create this presentation?
Correct, yeah. So this is actually done in Keynote, and I actually have a cell phone that can actually show you my current slide, next slide. I could even have notes on here. I don't typically use notes, but you can actually draw on the slide and everything else. So Keynote has mobile app things that I can do to cue next slides and kind of give me a prompter of how much time I have left and all of that. So I personally really like using Keynote the best. I will use PowerPoint if I have to, so I'm not trying to do a big pitch for Keynote today, but I prefer it.
Oh, great, thanks. And then Davey asks, what fonts do you recommend? Also minimum font size.
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and it really depends on what you're presenting and how much contrast. So that's why a lot of presentation developers will tell you to use dark backgrounds, because then if you do have some smaller text, the contrast is enough that makes it easier to read. Most of my font sizes are between 75 and 150. That's really big, and it keeps it really straightforward. And I'm usually using a widescreen presentation, so font sizes look different in the square version of like Letterbox versus like a widescreen presentation. So for widescreen though, typically between 75 and 150. I sometimes will go down to maybe 35-point font, but that's very selectively and very minimal amount of text at that height. So.
Okay, now from David Lewis, a commonly used rule of thumb used to coach presenters in one slide per minute of talk, particularly for data-rich slides. Can you compare and contrast this guideline with a 3-second rule?
Yeah, so the 3-second rule is just about when you're presenting new information and you need them to kind of engage with, they consume that information and they come back to you, the presenter. So as much as possible, if you do give like a big data set or something, the key is to do it one or two ways. One is that you can take that information and then you can start to break it out and simplify it and get towards the conclusion. Or you can do it the other way and you can start really small and kind of build to the bigger picture. It really depends on what story or narrative you're trying to talk about with the data. Yes, data is a really good one to talk about. So I usually try to figure out what is the core message that you have to deliver with this data set and focus on that as much as possible and then tease that out. So 3 seconds is really just more about how much time that it takes them to consume it in that moment, but it could take, 20 minutes even of you talking about data and slowly talking more about that data set.
Okay, thank you. And from Emily Delk, do you apply these same principles for presentations on a Zoom call when the presenter isn't visible?
Yeah, that's a really good question. With a webinar in general, it's a little different, but it is okay to have your slide deck kind of be the centerpiece and leave it on a slide for a while you're talking through it. I will say that with webinars, I find if you don't have a video of the presenter and if they're not getting that video feed, then it's okay to go at a faster pace because people will actually be more engaged if you actually have more slides for a webinar and you break topics up even smaller into smaller bits. So you're just breaking off little pieces at a time. So I tend to recommend that you're going a little faster if you want to keep engagement up.
And Adam, Anamik asks, is that website called Unsplash? Was it that?
Unsplash.com.
Unsplash.com.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. From Luke, are there problems with saving Keynote files in PowerPoint? Most conferences require PowerPoint. I have seen last-minute formatting difficulties in presentations in the past from this.
Yeah, so my best recommendations are obviously make time for that export if you know that you're going to have to get it into PowerPoint. However, there's just a couple of real basic things that can go wrong in that export. For example, dissolves in Keynote are kind of what the film industry coins that term of a dissolve, whereas PowerPoint doesn't. They actually use it as like a dither. And it's like blocks that kind of appear on the screen and it looks really pixelated. So if you have any dissolves on a Keynote, you're going to make sure you need to change it to fade in PowerPoint. That's a different type of a transition. You might notice even font sizes being a little different. That's why I usually, going back to the other question that I didn't fully answer about fonts, is I try to use a font that's pretty commonplace across Mac and PC. So I'll typically use something like Helvetica and use that throughout the presentation because it's much easier to make sure that that font is not going to have to be replaced in another version. That's why, although UC Davis has a Proxima Nova as the default font that we recommend for publications, print materials, things like that, for presentations, I still don't recommend you use that. I would recommend you use like Helvetica because at least you know you'll have that on a PC as well as a Mac. So using the base fonts is a good choice.
Okay, and one last question for today, so we can let Adam go back and have lunch. Davey asked, some people have told me that it's best not to use any text at all on PowerPoint presentations. I usually see PowerPoint presentations with lots of text. When would you try not to have any text versus when is it a good idea to have text?
Yeah, I think if you're using the photos to tell specifically a narrative or story about something, and it's really about an experience, then there's really no need to have any text on it. And so it depends on the context of what type of presentation you're trying to give. If you're telling a story about your past or an experience that leads to a moment, especially inspirational stuff, you tend to use just images without any text at all, because you're drawing more on the emotion than you are drawing on them trying to take some conclusion out of the slide. It just depends on the audience and depends on the subject matter. But I would say using some of your text mixed with imagery when it's more of an educational thing is good, because some people are going to learn in different ways and some people need to read text for them to kind of absorb it further. So just being very strategic with what key points I'm elevating to text on the slides. And I'll also just, because this is the last question, if you are interested in seeing the next segment of this presentation about how to give a good visual story narrative and the structure of a story, then please let us know in the comments, and then maybe that'll be enough encouragement to bring you back.
Yes, that'd be wonderful, Adam. And please, everyone, fill out the survey. Let us know how we're doing, what to start, stop, do in the future if you have any other topics you'd like to see. Thank you so much.